Welcome. It's great to see everybody on kind of a gray spring day. It's been so pleasant. It's a little cooler today, so
Thankfully.
yeah. So today we have Linda Mitchell talking to us about bookbinding, and of course, it's something I always have enjoyed myself. But
Gee, I wonder why.
Yeah. So among her many interests and talents has been bookbinding, and she started that when she was, were you a graduate student?
19.
Yeah, 19 in college and working in the library and helping with the preservation group at Indiana. So
At Sarah Lawrence.
Oh, Sarah Lawrence, I'm sorry.
And I was the preservation.
Yeah. Anyway, we're going to just turn it over to her, and she's going to do a little show and tell for us. So if you're not close, you may want to move in a little closer at some point. So
Virtually everything that's on the table is actually going to be in a slide, so don't worry about that too much. And if you do want to come up at the end and take a look at stuff, I'm going to ask you, please go wash your hands first, especially since you're handling food. We don't want goo on the books. When I'm doing a bookbinding workshop, there are 2 rules. First, you wash your hands. Well, 3 rules. First, you wash your hands. Second, you clean your glue brushes in the approved instructional method of cleaning the glue brushes, which I teach everybody the first day. And 3, don't get blood on the books.
You don't use gloves?
No, we don't use gloves. And in fact, now in archives, they decided they don't use gloves either, because they discovered that especially cotton gloves are too abrasive for the materials, and they actually do more damage than fingers do. It's just that the natural oils in your fingers are fine. It's anything over and above the natural oils of your fingers that can be problematic. So a little bit about, I mean, many of you have heard, some of you have heard this talk more than once because I've given it a few times in the Kansas City Metro, mostly at the behest of Ginny Blanton. I started as being trained to do book repair and sort of elementary bookbinding at my college library because they needed somebody to train, and they had some money that was not work study connected. So I was not eligible for work study, so because my dad thankfully paid for my college education, and so I said, sure. One of my best friends was working in the tech services department, and she said to me, hey, you want to learn how to repair books? And I said, yeah. And I mean, I was one of those nerds that wrote with a pen and an ink well. I would write letters home back, you know, and it wasn't the 18th century, although some of you might dispute that. So I became absolutely obsessed with bookbinding and book history and repairing books. And because I was also studying medieval stuff, because my area of I had 2 areas of concentration. We didn't have majors at my college. Were dance and medieval stuff. And so I just crammed as much as I could in, and I became, of course, fascinated with manuscripts and all that. And then got training at the Center for Book Arts in New York City in design binding, conservation binding, and basic preservation stuff with people who were binders at the Morgan Library and at the Watson at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and at the New York Botanic Gardens, which the Bronx Botanic Gardens has an amazing bindery. And then when I went to grad school, I walked into the library and went down to tech services and said, hey, I'm a bookbinder, here's my resume, do you need somebody to do book repair stuff? And they said, oh, expletive deleted, yes, we do. So I wound up working all through grad school as the trainer of students, and also doing the technician doing special work for the special collections. I made boxes for the Lilly Library, which is their rare book library, and got more training and did more workshops and learned a lot about some very specific kinds of conservation techniques. And then when I got my first academic job in history, wound up teaching history of the book and bookbinding, and as a combination studio and art history course for the fine arts program at Alfred University, which has a very large school of art and design. And then when I came here, everybody said, oh, could you do something with books? And I said, maybe, it depends. Do you have space? Oh, no, we don't. Well, then I can't. Because I had a bindery. We built a bindery for me at Alfred so that I could teach bookbinding. It was great. So anyway, I give a lot of workshops and do a lot of these kinds of lecture demo type things around the Kansas City Metro. I've done this about, I would say, at least a dozen times. And almost every year, Ginny asks me to come and do the song and dance for her classes. And I've done some consulting work as well on book repair. And so, so that's just a little brief background in my thing. This is not the stuff. I used to do crafts fairs. I used to make blank books and things like that and do crafts fairs in New York. And the thing that was really annoying were the people who would come up and say, well, my 6-year-old did that in school just last week. And it's like, not what I do. So it is, there is a history of book repair as well as a history of bookbinding and the creation of books that is very specific, frankly, very specific to the West, because Asian books are created differently and they have their own unusual and unique system for preservation and for production, printing, and binding that is very different from Western binding styles. And so my area of knowledge, my knowledge base is in Western binding styles, and so I'm not going to be talking about Asian books. But if you want to see some really gorgeous ones, we have some here. But we also, the Spencer Art Reference Library at the Nelson Atkins Museum has an incredible collection of Asian books that are fairly rare for, especially for the Midwest, and they're quite an unusual collection. Unfortunately, not in fabulous shape, so we're working on doing some fundraising to get some preservation done on those. So anyway, why do I call this uncovering books? Well, first of all, because books are covered usually, and when you have to repair them, you have to uncover them. But in addition to that, it's a pun, because books had a kind of aura around them for centuries upon centuries, to the point where they were the most prized possessions of people who gifted them in wills, donated them to monasteries, and so on in the Middle Ages. And as a result of that, books have a terminology that is almost entirely based on human anatomy. And that sounds nuts, but it is absolutely, and you don't even think about it when you talk about the spine of a book, right? And some of it has to do with some of the materials being used, because animal skins and so on were frequently used, especially before the early modern period when paper was developed in the West. But we actually, the terminology that we use as bookbinders has a lot of anatomical references. And so when you take a book apart, you don't take it apart, you break it down, like breaking down a hide of beef, a side of beef. There are all kinds of things that you do, including some things that might sound incredibly rude, because when you have to square up a text block, you call it knocking it up. Or sometimes knocking it down, but usually knocking it up. And bookbinders are punny, silly people generally, and very eccentric as a rule. So it makes sense that they would come up with these terms and use them, knowing that the double entendre that they're engaging in is going to confuse the lay audience significantly. So in the medieval West, and in the ancient world, they didn't use this kind of system, which is called a codex, to make books. They made books out of papyrus, mostly in the Mediterranean world, which did not bend well. It didn't fold. So they rolled it into scrolls by kind of gluing sheets of prepared parchment papyrus together. And in fact, the word paper comes from papyrus in Latin and in Romance languages. So, and that is what a book was. The word book comes from the Greek biblos, which was the name of a town in a city in what's now Lebanon. And Byblos was the center of book production, of scroll production for the ancient world. It was one of the places they made papyrus sheets and made the scrolls so that you could construct the book. So a book, a biblos, is a scroll, is not, in fact, what we think of. This is a codex, which is a Latin word, and that refers not to something with pages like this, because the Romans were cheap. They invented concrete, right? Because they couldn't be bothered to create temples and buildings that were made of stone the way the Greeks did. So instead, they invented concrete, made concrete structures, and slapped these marble facades on them that were usually about that thick, and so that their buildings would look fancy schmancy, right? The Romans wrote a lot of letters to each other because they had a very large empire and had a very efficient postal system. But they couldn't be bothered, and it was too expensive to use papyrus, which also doesn't do well in cold or damp climates. So great in Egypt, not so great in Rome in the summer, right? So what they did was they created a system for writing letters and taking notes and doing things like that. They made wooden frames, like a picture frame, hinged them together either in twos or in threes, where you would hinge them this way. And they filled the middle part of the frame with wax. And they would use a stylus, they would write their letters, fold up this codex, seal it, and send it off. And the person would read the letter, warm and smooth out the wax, take their stylus, write a reply, seal it, and send it back to the sender. And that's the system that the Romans used for a very, very, very long time. So one of the things about the codex is it's called a codex because it has a vague resemblance to those original wooden framed wax tablets. All right. So materials for bookbinding in the medieval West were almost overwhelmingly either animal products or vegetal. They used a little bit of metal for bosses and clasps and things like that, but most of the stuff that they made was using animal skins, animal products, and wood. Paper came to the West in about the 13th century. It had been developed in Asia and kind of worked its way through the Mediterranean world. But medieval people did not use paper. It was atrociously expensive, and it was also rather fragile until they had perfected a system where they could fold it, because of course the paper that was being used in Asia was used to make scrolls, not codices. So it's really in the 15th century that you begin to see more paper stuff. And in the 16th and 17th century is when paper begins to replace parchment or vellum, which is made out of either calf or sheepskin. The other thing about this is that there were two places that were the center for creation of vellum sheets and parchment sheets, super high quality to sort of pedestrian quality. And one is Spain and the other was the British Isles. And why? Because there were more sheep than people in large parts of the British Isles and in large parts of Spain. And if you got a sheep and it's no longer, the wool is no longer the quality that is sellable, then you eat it, but you also take the skins and you process them to make parchment. Calf is more valuable because they used cows for a greater variety of things than they had fewer cows. Cows are harder to raise than sheep. But so sheepskin and sheep products were an enormous component in the making of medieval manuscripts. They also used linen thread made of flax, sometimes with some hemp, or silk, or a combination of the two. Silk, it's obviously much more expensive, and you can't, silkworms, until the Florentines stole some, were unavailable. You had to get silk from Asia. So you used silk for very, very, very high quality, expensive things. So usually they use linen thread to sew the quires together. Now, a quire is a gathering of manuscript leaves, and it's spelled Q-U-I-R-E, which is how the British spell the area between the apse and the nave, right? The quire. A quire means a gathering, and you can spell it C-H-O-I-R, or you can spell it Q-U-I-R-E, and it means the same thing. So, so quires were gatherings of manuscript leaves, which were then sewn together, usually in very hurried fashion, and then organized according to whatever the manuscript was going to be for. They used oak or some other kind of hardwood for boards. I made this kind of, and I deliberately made the oak boards like way, way too huge for the size of the codex, right? But this is my my reproduction of what a medieval binding would look like if it were bound with oak boards. I used leather for the bands. I sewed it with linen thread, and then you insert. You have to chisel a hole that you insert the bands through, and then you either cover them or layer things on top of this, layers of vellum or and so on to secure those, and then the whole thing is then finished. So they used wooden boards when they were for a permanent kind of binding, but the most basic binding was called a student binding or a limp vellum binding. And what it was is a medieval version of a paperback book. All the books were made in different shops, all right? So the manuscript maker would make the manuscript in separate quires that were unsewn. Somebody would go in, this is by the 14th century for sure, especially with books of hours and psalters and things like that. They would purchase the quires they wanted to purchase. They'd hire an illuminator to put miniatures on. Sometimes the miniatures were pre-made and they would glue them onto the parchment. They would tip them in. And then, once that was happening, if the person wanted the book and didn't want to take it directly to a bookbinder to have it bound, then the bookseller, would quickly sew the book together, slap a vellum cover on it, and hand it to the purchaser. Now the purchaser could then go next door to the bookbinder, order their binding, and the binder would then sew it on raised bands and make it pretty and do all of that stuff. This is an original binding of a 16th century book. Actually, I think it's 17th century. I'll be getting, it's farther down in the slideshow. And this is made of paper, but this was bequeathed to me by one of my predecessors at Alfred University, who had it in his possession and then left it in a box when he passed away, and his widow didn't want it. So my colleague said, "There's a box of stuff for you." And I was like, okay. And then I pulled this out and I said, "Are you kidding me?" Because this is, it's not a first edition, but it is an early edition of Christopher Clavelius's disputation with Galileo on the two world systems. And it was published in, let me see if I can find the date here, 1607. And this is the original binding. So this is sort of a prized possession of mine. And I keep on saying, I need to make a box for it, and I just haven't had time to do that. So, so that's all of this stuff. Now they used animal hide glue or flour paste glue, usually animal hide glue for putting, because you do animal product with animal product and vegetable product with vegetable product, generally. And animal hide glue adheres extremely well. It's very, very durable. It's impossible to remove. And flour paste glue, it heats up, gets wet, the whole thing will fall apart, right? And then the only time they used metals were for what they called bosses, which were little round knobs that they would put on the, usually on the underside of the binding, sometimes on top too, and that was because when they stacked the books up, they didn't want to disturb the binding. It was protected the bindings, because they didn't rest the books the way we do in a bookshelf. They stacked them and chained them to the book press, which is what they called bookshelves in those days. So that's the only time they used metal. Everything else was made out of either wood or animal products. Decorated paper like marbled paper was not invented until the 16th century because it required chemicals and processes that medieval people didn't really have time to experiment with. But in the 13th century, medieval people did create a kind of decorated paper called paste paper, where you take flour paste and you make a thin emulsion of flour paste, and then you take tempera paint, which is the paint that they used. They didn't use oil paints in those days. And you color pots of this thin emulsion wheat flour paste, and you brush it onto wet paper. You needed paper, you couldn't do this on vellum, right? So this is when paper is invented, they start decorating it. So they would dampen the paper, they would brush the paste in stripes or in different ways onto the paper, and then they would take tools or their fingers, it's like finger paint, and they would make decorative swirls and do all kinds of other fun things with it. And then when it dried, they would, because the emulsion was usually thin enough so that it wasn't, these days we put glycerin in it. They might have done so too, because they could get glycerin from calves' feet. But it would be flexible enough to be able to use as a paste down on the inside or a cover. But these were fairly fancy sorts of alternatives to different kinds of decorations. Tools and equipment. I brought what I call my traveling toolbox with me. Medieval tools for bookbinding and modern tools for bookbinding are virtually identical. The only difference is that some of the materials are a little bit different. They used more wood than we do these days. We use more metal for book presses and things like that. But for the most part, the tools that I have in my toolbox, a medieval person would find, medieval bookbinder would find completely normal. So the first tool that every bookbinder has to have is called a bone folder. And why? Because it's made of bone and it folds things. These days, if you go to Amazon and go to bookbinding, they have a gazillion bookbinding tools on Amazon. They make bone folders out of plastic. Plastic bone folders are crap. Total, utter crap. But bone folders are wonderful things. They are durable. I have one in here that's my favorite bone folder. I have had this bone folder since 1975. You can take a little bit of grinding paper, sanding paper. You can sand them down so I have a nice sharper edge here. You can smooth them, you can scrub them. They're nice and smooth. They're a wonderful thing. However, very recently, somebody came up with the brilliant idea of Teflon bone folders. They still call them bone folders, even though they're not made of bone. But Teflon has wonderful properties. It's flexible, but it doesn't break. you can make it super, super thin, or you can make it very heavy. And it's non-abrasive, right? You can polish these things to a sheen so that you can, and you know what Teflon does, it's no stick. So if you get it gluey, it's not going to attach itself to anything. These are one of the things that I use. These are lifting tools, and they're to
Linda,
get,
why would you fold something? I mean,
because you have to fold paper to make a quire.
okay, I get it.
And you have to fold all, but folding stuff is basically step one of all bookbinding stuff.
But how big would sheets be in the 14th century?
As large as a piece of vellum, all right, large as a sheepskin,
I get it.
or when you made paper frames, the standard paper frame is usually around 16 by 22. And that folds down into what's called an ottavo, an 8-sheet, 16-sided quire. But if you're repairing books, you often need to very delicately lift things off of the boards and so on. This is a lifting tool I got many years ago. It's not sharp, but it has a very narrow blade, and it's designed so that you can slide underneath things very carefully. This is a Teflon lifting tool. It is so much better than this one. And that's the first Teflon tool I got because I was talking to a bookbinder and he was like, what's the deal with these Teflon tools? And they said, you need a lifter. And I said, I do? Okay. So I went and got one, and sure enough, I am addicted. So things that are sharp are very common in bookbinding. Knives, needles of various kinds. I have my needle collection includes needles that are curved, needles that are straight, shorter needles, longer needles. But because linen thread is heavy, they all have to have fairly large eyes. So I go for craft collections like this. This is another kind of lifting knife. It looks like a giant palette knife, but you can actually sharpen this to make a sharp blade. Bookbinders tools. Whoops. This is one variety of leather paring knife. Yes, it is just a slab of metal that has been sharpened. That's all it is. This is an English paring knife because they like sharp, pointy things at the end, which I do not. This is a Swiss paring knife, which is another slab o' metal, but with a rounded edge and a different bevel for the blade. And the thing I like about this one is that when you're paring leather, you have to clamp it down onto a surface that we usually use lithostones or marble. And this has to be fiendishly sharp. And then what you do is you're paring the edges of the leather until they're paper thin. It's a very laborious process, but it is basically the only way to fold over the leather so that it is smooth and adheres to the edge of the board. When I was doing my training, one of the bookbinders I worked with preferred this, which is basically a planer, a hand plane, in which the blade has been altered to a different bevel. And she insisted that we all had to do this, and you had to very laboriously shave millimeters off of your leather, but you got a very smooth. She liked it because it was super smooth. The problem is that if you're doing a commission for somebody and you're charging by the hour, it is hard enough to talk somebody into spending $1,000 to repair a book because they want a leather-bound book, where it takes an hour to pare, using a hand knife, a piece of leather, as opposed to the 10 hours that it would take to do it with the planer. I gotta say. So, awls and drills, I have various and sundry kinds of other sharp, pointy things in here. I use wine corks to protect them and my fingers when I'm reaching into my toolbox. Anybody know what this is? it's a dissecting pin. I haunt medical supply places for scalpels and these kinds of things because, first of all, they're super sharp. Secondly, they're cheap, and they do dull eventually, so you have to throw them away. And they work a lot better than a handle, unless you have to really push hard on things. This is a bookbinder's awl. All right, and this is great because you can hold it like this and poke, but I'm constantly having to configure the tip because it bends. It's very fragile. All right, so tooling was something that was developed in the Middle Ages, and they didn't use gold and silver for tooling of leather covers. Initially, they did something called blind tooling, which is basically they heated a tool and then they pushed it into the leather, and that created a mark, and it darkened the leather very slightly. The process of making gold leaf and using it and figuring out how to make it adhere to leather was a somewhat later process. If they wanted to really make a fabulous decorative binding, they would bejewel it. All right, they would. What do we call that now? When somebody plays with all of those sparkly things. I can't remember the name of it. It's something teenagers do to their book bags, and what our graduates do to their
glitter,
to their mortar boards. So changes in bookbinding. Paper made of rags and eventually wood pulp replaced vellum for the most part. Board made out of pressed wood rather than oak became the norm. Sewing was done by hand in the West everywhere until 1879. By hand, every book, until the invention of the multi-thread Smythe sewing machine, which is still in business, and they're still making them. And guess who did all of that sewing and never got the recognition for it and was paid half of what the finishers were paid?
Women.
Cloth has replaced leather most of the time. Initially impregnated with starch, which is what buckram is, and now conservation cloth is fine linen that is backed with paper so that there's not a lot of adhesive and there are not a lot of off gases. We use iron presses, metal presses. Now I have a wonderful one that's an enameled surface book press that is a wonderful, what's called a nipping press. Those replace wooden presses because they don't warp. And modern day adhesives, which are much less acidic and are durable but remain flexible, also eventually replace animal glue. Although when I was learning bookbinding back in the 1970s, we still had a glue pot with chunks of hide glue that we could use if we wanted to. It was disgusting, and we never wanted to do it because it's stinky and it's horrible. And we had to clean spines that were covered in the stuff all the time. But they were still, the major library suppliers were still selling glue pots and hide glue in the 1970s and 80s. And then plastic bone folders, synthetic brushes, like this one. Well, actually, no, both of these are natural bristle brushes. But some of the synthetics are actually better than the original for bookbinding if you're doing conservation work, because the thing that kills a book is acidity. Air, light, dust, and oxidation. Okay, parts of the modern book. This is where we get into all this anatomical stuff. You have the spine, the head, the tail, the foredge. Inside the book is called a gutter. All right, that's the place where the folds are in the quire. You have the part of the front cover in the inside that's pasted down is called a paste down, and the end paper, the free end paper, is called an end sheet. The front, this part of the book, the part that opens, is called a foredge. The place where the boards attach to the spine of the book is called a joint. And then you could have raised bands, or you could have what's called a hollow back book. There are different styles of bookbinding, and there are several examples of those here. So this gives you a breakdown of all of the books and how they were organized. Okay, making parchment, and this is a modern photograph, and they still do make parchment, and they still make them out of goatskin, but they don't collect human urine anymore to soak the skin. The parchment makers would pee on the parchment, and they would go around, and the night soil collectors would collect urine, and they needed that for the leather business and the parchment business, because that's how they broke down the fiber in the sheepskin or goatskin or calf skin. So you'd start with something that's sheep shaped, right? After you've taken off and you have the hair side and the skin and the meat side, the suede side, right? And you have to do several things. It has to be more flexible, it has to be larger, it has to be thinner, and you have to get the hair off, and you have to get as much meat off as you possibly can on the underside. So you do this through a long process of stretching it and soaking, and stretching and scraping and soaking, until you get a workable material that is actually like 3 times its original size. All right, they can stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch, which is how you can get those giant medieval books, right, that are made folio-sized books, where you have and they would use the spine of the animal, the center bit, which is always the toughest part. It's the thickest part of the skin. They would use that as where they would make their folds for the quires, right, because that would be the toughest bit. And since you're poking holes into it, you want it to be sturdier than the more flexible edges. So, and the other reason why you want heavy oak boards when you're making books out of parchment and vellum, and you want to have the clasps at the end, is because even though you have processed the daylights out of that sheepskin, it still wants to return to sheep shape. And the only way to keep it flat is to weigh it down, which is also why they stacked them like that. Because if they stacked them on their tails, they would expand this way, which is still a problem when books get wet. Okay, supported binding is the original style of bookbinding for permanent binding is supported sewing. So there are other kinds of sewing that are unsupported, but the basic medieval form was on raised bands using hemp cord or linen cord that you sew along the spine, and then you physically attach to your boards. This is a particular kind of binding called a concertina binding. It's a conservation binding that where you make these little tiny guards and you sew them onto the quires, so that the only thing that is connecting your very valuable book to the binding is thread, so that if you have to remove it, doesn't invade and you don't damage the book. You're sewing what's called guards, concertina guards, in other words, like an accordion. So this is a technique that I learned to do for rare books, which I don't do very often. But I wanted to do a template that showed you what raised bands look like, because this is if you buy go to a bookseller and they have these really pretty books made with bonded leather, which is powdered leather that's glued together with polyvinyl acetate into sheets and rolled, and they pretend that it's real leather. And then you see that they've got bands on the outer edge, but somehow or other the book opens like a normal book. Those are called false raised bands, and they're decorative. They have no function at all on the book. So that shows you a kind of supported sewing, and then how you tie it in. You feather the cord and so that it adheres to your boards. These are examples of unsupported sewing, chain link sewing, also known as a Coptic binding, even though it did not originate in Egypt. It probably originated in Turkey. And this is an example of a Coptic binding. So what it is to do an unsupported sewing, you need a lot more stitching. And what you do is you link each of your supports to each other, and that's how you make the book adhere. So if you go to World Market and you go and look at their blank books, they have very pretty blank books and they're very reasonably priced. All of them are Coptic sewn. They all have exposed spines, and you can see the stitching on them, which is kind of cool. And this is also very, very handy to teach when you're doing workshops in which there is no access to water or glue or a board shear or anything like that. So when I do bookbinding workshops for people and I'm bringing in the materials, all we have are pieces of paper, needles, and thread. And this is what I teach. This is a medieval style, and this is similar to the one that I made, the template that I made. Those are not my fingers. That is a much more prominent medieval reproduction binder. But if you see how I split this, the leather tape, in order to do a series of double stitches, and that also makes the book a lot sturdier. It also makes it very stiff at the spine. And in a medieval book, you wanted it to be stiff because the book opens differently than a hollow back. Hollow backs do something which bookbinders call hollow backs throw up against the boards. They make a curve, an arch against the boards, and books that are sewn on tapes or cords don't do that. They, I'm not sure if I have an example. When you open them, none of these pages are cut, so it's not going to fan open in the same way. But if you have a book that is sewn using cords or tapes or unsupported and not a hollow back, then the pages lie flat and they fan out, and so it's much easier to open the book. Hollowbacks were invented in the 19th century, the land of all the terrible things that bookbinders did to books were invented pretty much in the 19th century. Just to let you know, adding wood pulp to paper, doing all kinds of other horrible things. These are two medieval bindings in their original condition, 12th century and 15th century, and you see there's very little difference between them. Bookbinding did not substantially change. I didn't include a photograph. I've been working on doing some research on a manuscript at the Boston Public Library, which is not in its original binding, but is in a binding in which somebody repurposed medieval boards and bound the book, probably in the 16th century, but maybe later. I haven't quite figured that one out yet. So people were doing that. They would take old books and take them apart and use the materials and then pass it off as a medieval book. This is a reproduction. You can get the materials for this in a kit, which is kind of wild. This is a jeweled binding. The cover is original, but the binding is not. The binding is 19th century. This is the Lindisfarne Gospels, which was a magnificent book created in the north of England. Is now, when the monastery of Lindisfarne was invaded by the Vikings, they fled to what's now Durham. The manuscript kind of wandered around, and this is now in the British Library. When you're conserving a medieval book, and you can see these are bosses, these bumps are metal bosses. When you're conserving a medieval book, you want to try not to take it apart. That's rule number one these days. In the 19th century, they just ripped the covers off and went at it. So this is very typical, where they're very delicately inserting modern materials that they're very carefully sewing onto it and then kind of retrofitting into the binding so that they don't have to remove the binding. This is hard to do, I gotta tell you. But the Victoria and Albert Museum has become a center for book conservation, more so than the British Library, weirdly. And they are becoming very expert at repairing medieval bindings. And there are very few medieval bindings that are extant these days because of the propensity in the 19th century and 18th century to remove all the covers and rebind everything. This is one of my favorite things, a girdle book. Girdle books are weird. So a girdle book was literally that. It was if you were riding on a horse or a donkey, or walking, if you were a monk, and you needed to read your Bible or your Gospels or your Psalter, you made a book that had in which you created this ball of leather at the end, which you tucked into your belt, and it hung down to your side, and then you could pick it up, and it's upside down and backwards, right? Because you would be picking it up and reading it as you walk or ride or whatever. The reason why there's only 20 of them left in the world today is because obviously they got a lot of very hard use, and so they are very difficult to make and very difficult to open. I had a student one time who wanted to make a girdle book, so he tried. He was determined and discovered how hard it actually is to make one. This is a modern day reproduction of one. And note that the cords, instead of being tied in, are just glued on, and it's because the book is so stiff, because it's getting such wear and tear, it needs to be sturdy. It's almost impossible to keep it open. This is my Christopher Clavellis on Two World Systems. And this is my display of books, many of which are out here. Some of which seem to have gone walkabout. I'm not quite sure what happened to some of them. I know some of them I actually bound, so there you go. So they're sitting on a bookshelf somewhere. You might be a devotee of the Folio Society or the some of these specialty book clubs. These are Folio Society, modern day Folio Society decorated covers. And then this one, the Henry van Dyck, the Blue Flower, is a typical Art Nouveau style binding. And you can go into antiquarian booksellers or used bookstores and find all kinds of gorgeous, gorgeous books that were very beautifully bound and that nobody cares about anymore, and that you can buy for a song. And I kind of collect them. Because I love the Art Deco and the Art Nouveau binding. These are some examples of some bindings that I've done. BB was hoping to be here today. I'm not sure what happened, but I'll bet you're having trouble seeing this because the lights have been on all this time. She asked me to rebind or do something with a book that had been her grandfather's. It was a first edition of a book that was kind of a history of architecture in Sweden. And She didn't tell me that the book was approximately this big, and didn't tell me that it weighed 30 pounds all by its little lonesome self. She just asked, and she sent me photographs and told me, and so when I went to pick up the book, or she actually brought it to one of our EC meetings, and I took a look at it, I thought, oh crap, okay, well, I'll see what I can do. The problem was that it had been in a binding that was too flimsy for the size of the text block and the weight of the text block. And after years, of course, it had deteriorated. So this is what it originally looked like. And it is a wonderful, magnificent book. And the front hinge had split off, the back hinge had split off. It had the leather had completely oxidized. So I cleaned it all up. I did something similar to what you do with a medieval book. I didn't want to take the book apart. I didn't want to take the boards off the book because they were still intact and the tapes were still intact. So what I did was I relined the spine, and then I covered it in leather, and I'd gotten a specific kind of leather that's made in France now, which is actually legitimate skins, but they have machine paired virtually all of the suede side off. So they are very flexible but durable. But I wound up backing it with Japanese paper, with washi, because it was such a big book, and I needed to be able to manipulate the leather, and I needed for it not to get really stretchy. So I backed the leather with paper the way you do with a conservation book cloth, and rebound the spine side, repaired the corners, and reconditioned them. Basically soaked the daylights out of them with leather conditioner so that they re-moisturized, and then made a box for them. So this is the pieces of the box. This is me binding the box in 2 different kinds of book cloth, because my book cloth was literally not wide enough to cover the entire box, which is double the size of the book, right? And this is buckram on the spine, and Hotland, which is a linen finished conservation book cloth, on the rest of the book. So this is the finished product, and that's the book sitting in its cover. And I was able to preserve. It took some doing the title piece of the spine by encasing it in washi, actually, so that it would lie flat and it was protected. There are lots of websites. There are lots of places. YouTube has hundreds of videos of bookbinders doing fun things with books. Lots of crazy sewing styles and so on. But if you want to look at pretty books, then you go to the British Library's website and things like that, and you can see gorgeous manuscripts. They're not really into the bindings so much. Questions. We still have a few minutes.
Yes. When you deal with I was in Rome at the archive, secret archive of the Vatican in last century, and did you notice any smell of the old books?
Oh, they're filthy for one thing. I used to. They have, yes, the animal glue has a very distinctive odor, and then also a lot of books in archives, especially in places that don't have a lot of, until very recently didn't have a lot of environmental controls, they got moldy. Bookworms are a real thing. Yeah. All right, so there's evidence of bookworm damage in this book. They're actually larvae that burrow into the books. So yes, there are very distinctive smells. But the other problem is that they're never cleaned. So when I was a graduate student and I was doing my dissertation research at the Public Record Office in London, I'd be going through 13th century plea rolls. These are massive scrolls of that are transcripts of litigation. And by the end of the day, my hands would be black because they had never been cleaned.
Yeah.
At the National Library of Ireland, in their manuscript reading room, their method of air circulation was that they opened the windows, which did not have screens on them, and the pigeons would come in to visit.
Oh.
And they had radiators for heat. So, and I believe it's still like that. They haven't moved the manuscripts reading room yet.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really fun. Yes, Jake.
The books that you show here also on the table have a flat aspect.
Yes.
So, while some of the ones, and especially BB's one, had a very curved
Yes,
outside and then
Mhm.
became a straight one. Is that an requirement for whatever reason?
It is not a requirement. This is a technique, again, developed in the 18th century when they began to stop using wooden boards. There's a system called rounding and backing. You have to have a special press that has a beveled edge on the top. And then what you do is you take the text block, like this one, for example, and you hold it against the table and you pull, and you take what's called a backing hammer, and you whack it with a hammer. Now, you're not whacking it hard, and this is what I always found amusing, because they said that women who were sewing text blocks until 1870s, right, 14 hours a day, were not strong enough to do this to this book. You have to do this very carefully and very gently, and eventually what you get is a rounded edge with this, this is called the swell of the book, because it's the sewing side, right? The swell expands, and then you put it into this backing press and you tap down the edges of the book to form a shoulder. And that's how you get that rounded bit. But that medieval books didn't do that, because they didn't have anything that was that could have the pounds of pressure enough to be able to make a backing press, right? You needed levers and metal edges and all kinds of other things. But
So that is not a requirement for a book which
No.
has a
it does
round.
not, you do not have to have a rounded back. And in fact, it's not good for the book. It does help with a large book for the book to open, because what you're basically doing is you're destroying the threads as you're hitting it with a hammer, right? And you're destroying the material on the paper, on the spine. You're spreading the all of the fibers away from each other. So you're making them more fragile for the aesthetics of having a rounded back. It helps with the book opening, but ultimately it also causes the book to crack along the spine more frequently and so on. And if you do this and you have a hollow back book where the book is throwing up, it's trying to go in the reverse of that curve, then the amount of pressure along where the book is joined to the boards is so extreme. It's why if you take an old book and you open it and you hear a crack, almost always it's the hinge that has cracked open. And that's simply because of the mechanics of how the book is made. Medieval books are much more durable because they were made differently. They were designed to be opened rather than designed to sit on a shelf for a designer to make look pretty.
Yeah. Yes. I have another question.
I think Felicia,
Oh,
did
I'm
you
sorry.
have
Go ahead.
No, Felicia had a question, I thought. Okay, go ahead, Felicia.
You said that for the Greeks, biblos was the scroll, right?
Yes.
So, do you know by any chance if the first texts or versions of the Bible were in scroll?
Well, the Hebrew scriptures are all scrolls, yes.
Oh yeah.
As were the Septuagint, the Greek Holy Scriptures are all scrolls. The first verifiable codices that we have, biblical codices, are from I think it's the 6th or 7th century CE, and they're only in fragmentary form. The first, Carly, help me out here. I think the first complete codex of the Christian Bible is like 11th century, isn't it? Or
Was very, very, very.
because most of the time, like even the early medieval ones are just gospels. They're not the whole thing.
Oh.
What is it? The Codex Aureus, which is Bede's Bible. That's 9th century, a little after Bede, but that is more or less complete. But yes, virtually every biblical text is in scroll form in its earliest version. And it's also why in synagogues they still use scrolls. And often make them out of actual
Vellum.
parchment.
Have you seen the scroll of the Black Dead or the Dead Sea?
The Dead Sea, well, there's what, 400 scrolls, but most of them are, and they're now doing, I think CT scans to kind of digitally unroll them.
You don't even have to unroll them.
Yeah.
Right, because they're able to take, so it must be an MRI because that's the one that makes slices
Yes.
of things. And
Makes
so-
a tomography and then
Yeah, I know, because I
Put 'em
have to have an
together.
MRI done on my head every year, so I get to see that. But so what they're doing is they're taking MRIs and they're getting slices, and then they're piecing together the lettering, and they're starting. This is going to take a long time to do, but they've got about 1/10 of one of the scrolls deciphered.
AI is speeding that up dramatically.
Yes,
at
well,
this point.
in terms of reading
Yeah.
the paleography, yes.
And also putting it together.
Putting it together, and the more information that they are able to feed into the computers, the easier it's going to get. But the problem is that they can only feed the information into the computer of stuff that's already been deciphered, and it could easily be that the Qumran texts are unique, many of them, that they exist only in that form, and so they don't have anything to compare it to. So it is fun stuff.
But there is the earliest translation of a language that they did not know what the script looked like
Right.
by way of AI has now been deciphered, and the text being
What, linear A?
I think it's one of the Cretensians
Yeah,
one.
linear A is the one that has, because we don't know what the Minoan people of Minoan Crete actually spoke,
Yeah.
and it's a
And there's not enough of the linear rate.
and there's not enough of the linear A, and it's a syllabary, not an alphabet. So
Right.
so we don't know how
Linear B
the
is much better.
well, it's because it's Greek.
That's right.
Thank you, Michael Ventris, right?
Yes, Michael Ventris.
Michael Ventris, who
Yeah,
was
we
a
should-
code breaker in World War II.
Yeah, we should get the guy who was driving the truck that killed him.
Other questions? Yes, this was a little moment between the medievalists. Yes,
This is
Marilyn.
not a question, but you guys will have a good laugh on this. I inherited an old house. It's about 70 years old, but my father-in-law was a pastor, and he haunted old booksellers. So I have a couple of 17th century manuscripts. And
Oh, wonderful.
I don't think they're worth much, but I have them. But the ones that were done in the 19th century, how many of you have ever been to Florida for any length of time? Anybody? Okay, well, we have something there called palmetto bugs.
Oh
And
no.
they have managed to leave their own scrolling as
Oh,
they
yeah.
have eaten both the
Yeah.
spines as well as the covers of
Yeah,
some
yeah.
of my books. And
Yes,
it makes me
cockroaches-
feel bad, and there isn't much you can do, at least as an individual.
Cockroaches love paper and
Oh.
love paste, love glues. And one of the reasons to use PBA, polyvinyl acetate, mixed with methyl cellulose is that methyl cellulose is, people use it if they have digestive issues. It's completely edible kind of a vegetal substance that makes a very flexible, useful, and what's called reversible adhesive for bookbinding. But we usually mix it with PBA, which is a very fancy, refined form of Elmer's glue, because cockroaches don't like PBA. And palmetto bugs are giant cockroaches, basically.
Send them to DeSantis.
No, it is a problem. Vermin in books. And we had, at the bindery in Indiana, we had this problem. We had a bat who fell in love with the bindery and liked to sleep under the workbenches. And we kept on capturing it and having the guys, take it outside, and it kept on coming back. So, but they didn't really disturb the books. They just, bats just poo everywhere. So
It's a lot of fertilizer.
guano, yes, the guano wars of Chile, yes. Well, thank you all for your attention. To come up and and leaf through these, I'm just going to ask you just to run to the restroom and wash your hands, and I'm happy to talk about things. This is the box. This is my template box. This is what I use when I'm training people how to make boxes and what they're supposed to look like. I made this box in 1987.
That's cool.
That's the nice thing about doing actual book repair that doesn't use like flimsy clear tape, which was what we called the book repair tape that they sell. And my friend and I, who were doing working in the bindery, we decided that flimsy clear tape was a good name for a heroine in a series of mysteries about librarians that we were going to call Against the Grain. But yeah, we were really nerdy back in the 70s, and not that I'm any less nerdy now.
Marvelously done.
So anyway, thank you, and come up and take a look at stuff.
And
After we wash our
do that first, and then come
And then eat bud cakes. Eat beautiful bud cakes.
on the books.
So, and also, this is off the record, but I for holiday presents and stuff, because I needed to get into my bindery and do a little, like something that didn't involve collating data and translating Latin. Whoops, what did I just do? Okay, I can turn this off now anyway. I had a bunch of blank book forms that I took the covers off of. Their little soft cover blank book forms. Very, very nice paper from Levenger that I gotten years ago, and I made a bunch of little blank books. So what I want to say is, this is the last one. This is a lovely little Victorian reproduction wallpaper of lovebirds, right? Which is beautiful paper, really nice heavy duty paper, nicely bound. It will not fall apart. I will sell to the highest bidder to donate the money to the endowment for the EC. For our ECFA awards. So you can take pictures of it, or somebody can buy it today and hand Bonnie the check.
Here we go.
Wow.
Or take it.
What does something like that go for? I mean,
Less
I
than
wouldn't want to
the
say
award.
$20 and offend. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, if somebody, let me put it this way: I gave BB the family discount and still lost money on what I made for her, and it was not inexpensive. When I do these kinds of things, I usually sell them for about $50 a piece.
That tells me, you know what I mean? Because
Yeah, because my going rate is $75 an hour, and I do production line, hand production line for those, and it takes about 45 minutes to make one
yeah,
from start to
thank you.
finish. Okay.
Thank you, Linda.
Awesome.